All right, buckle up, because today's deep dive is going to get a little weird, even for us.
Oh, is that so?
We're talking about buildings,
Yep.
but not just any buildings.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the idea that buildings could, be alive.
Sentient buildings. Yeah,
And not just sentient, but possibly, maybe, a little bit. Evil.
yeah, it's definitely one of the more out there theories we've explored.
Yeah. The kind of thing you'd expect to find on a dusty old conspiracy theory website somewhere.
Right, right. But that's what we do here. We dive into these strange corners of thought and see if there's anything to them, even if it's just a fun thought experiment.
Exactly. And this one, it really gets you thinking about, like, the power of the places we inhabit, the way a building can make you feel.
It's true. We all have those places where we just feel uneasy or places where we feel strangely comfortable, and it's not always easy to explain why.
Okay, so sentient, maybe even evil buildings. Where does this idea even come from?
Well, it's actually got surprisingly deep roots. Ancient cultures often believed certain structures had a spiritual presence, like temples or pyramids.
Oh, absolutely. It makes sense when you think about those incredible structures, the pyramids or Stonehenge. They do kind of have this energy about them.
Right, and this theory is kind of taking that idea and running with it. What if those ancient cultures were onto something? What if those structures really did have some kind of consciousness?
And not just any consciousness, but one that could be influencing events, maybe even manipulating people.
Yeah, it's definitely a more extreme version of the idea. But again, it's a fascinating thought experiment. It taps into that very human tendency to look for patterns, to find meaning in the world around us.
Okay, so we've got ancient mysticism, and then there's the whole human psychology angle. But I feel like we're dancing around the big conspiracy theory here, which is, of course,
Oh, here we go.
Freemasons.
Of course. We wouldn't have a proper deep dive without mentioning the Freemasons.
Right, they're like the secret ingredient in every good conspiracy theory.
And there are definitely some theories out there about the Freemasons imbuing buildings with certain energies, using their knowledge of symbolism and architecture to influence people.
Okay, now that's just spooky. So these buildings aren't just, like, accidentally sentient. There's this idea that they're designed that way,
Mhm.
with a purpose.
Some people believe so, yeah. That there are groups out there who know how to manipulate the energy of a place, who build with a specific intention in mind.
Like some kind of architectural mind control. That's kind of unsettling.
Yeah, it's definitely a bit creepy when you think about it.
Okay, so we've gone from ancient beliefs to secret societies
Mm-hmm.
to buildings that could be secretly controlling the world. Are you starting to get creeped out yet?
I'm intrigued, let's put it that way.
Well, hold on to your hats, because we're about to get into some even wilder claims.
Yeah.
We're talking buildings manipulating history, influencing major events.
It's a bold claim, that's for sure.
It is. But is it really that far-fetched? Think about it. Buildings shape our lives in so many ways, even if we don't realize it. So is it really impossible to imagine that some buildings, maybe the right buildings, could shape the course of history?
Well, let's just say the idea raises some interesting questions about the relationship between people and the spaces they inhabit.
Okay, so maybe we're not saying the White House is whispering to presidents, but maybe, just maybe,
Yeah.
the design of a place can nudge people in a certain direction, influence their thoughts, their decisions.
That's the idea, yeah. It's not necessarily about conscious control, but more about subtle influence.
Okay, so far we've gone from ancient mysteries to secret societies to potentially mind-controlling buildings. But let's bring this back down to earth for a second, okay?
Yeah.
Because even if you're not convinced that buildings are secretly running the world, I think we can all agree that some places just feel off, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like you walk into a room and you just get this weird vibe. You know what I'm talking about.
We've all been there. Some spaces just have this energy, and it's not always positive.
It's like they haven't paid their rent in good vibes or something.
Exactly. And while I wouldn't necessarily say it's because the building is evil, there is a growing body of research showing that our surroundings can have a real impact on our mental and emotional well-being.
Right. Like we all know, being out in nature can totally shift your mood. Could it be that our modern buildings, especially here in the city, are actually contributing to stress and anxiety, even making us sick?
It's certainly possible. Think about how much time we spend indoors, surrounded by artificial light and recycled air. Studies have shown that even something as simple as exposure to sunlight can significantly impact our mood, sleep patterns, even how well our brains function.
Wow, so if a little sunshine can make that much of a difference, imagine the impact a whole building could have.
Exactly. And that's where this whole sentient buildings idea, as out there as it might seem, actually gets pretty interesting. Maybe it's not about buildings literally being malevolent, but more about us becoming aware of how our design choices, even unintentional ones, might be affecting us in ways we never realize.
I see what you're saying. Like, we tend to think of buildings as these permanent fixtures in our lives, but they really exist on a spectrum, right? And with all the advancements in technology, that spectrum is getting even more interesting by the day. Speaking of which,
Mm.
what about automated buildings? That's going to play into this whole buildings replacing humans thing a little.
It's definitely a valid concern. When we're talking about smart buildings that can learn our preferences, adjust the lighting or temperature, even handle security based on who's around, it's not a huge leap to imagine those systems becoming so sophisticated they don't really need us at all.
Okay, that's where I start to get a little creeped out. Anyone else suddenly having flashbacks to that episode of The Twilight Zone with the house that takes over? Just me.
Huh, I see what you mean. But in all seriousness, those
Hmm.
sci-fi scenarios, and they tap into a very real anxiety we have about technology exceeding our grasp.
Right. We like to think we're the ones in control, but what happens when our creations start making decisions for us? Even if it's just deciding when to turn down the thermostat. I mean, is a building that can think for itself automatically a bad thing? Or are we just letting our fear of the unknown get the best of us? I kind of don't want to know the answer to that.
Well, I wouldn't start boarding up your windows just yet. The bigger question here is, how do we approach these advancements responsibly? How do we make sure that as buildings get smarter, they're still designed to serve us, not the other way around?
Right, because nobody wants to end up trapped in their own energy-efficient, perfectly temperature-controlled, AI-run prison cell.
Exactly. And that's where this whole conversation shifts from spooky theories to a very real discussion about the future of design and technology. If we accept that our environments have a powerful influence over us, then we need to be a lot more intentional about how we design those environments, especially as technology becomes more integrated into our buildings.
So it's not just about building bigger and taller anymore, it's about building smarter and more human-centered.
Exactly. We need to consider the psychological impact of everything. The light, the sounds, the materials, even the flow of energy within a space, how people interact with their environment and with each other.
It's almost like we need to start designing with empathy. Not just empathy for the people who are going to be using those spaces, but for the spaces themselves.
That's an interesting way to put it. And it actually ties into a growing movement in architecture and design called biophilia. Have you heard of that?
Biophilia.
Yeah, it basically focuses on the importance of incorporating elements of nature into our built environments.
Oh, right. Like having more plants in offices and stuff.
Exactly. It's about using natural light, incorporating organic shapes and patterns, even soundscapes that mimic the natural world. And it's not just about aesthetics either.
Right.
There's actually a whole field of research showing that this kind of design can have a real impact on people's well-being.
Less sterile office cubicle. More like working in a treehouse. I can get behind that.
Precisely. And it can actually improve focus, boost productivity, even reduce sick days. There are studies that show this.
So it sounds like we might not be seeing sentient skyscrapers having an existential crisis anytime soon, but
Not today.
by going down this rabbit hole of a theory, we might have actually stumbled onto a whole new way of thinking about the spaces we inhabit. And maybe, just maybe, a way to design buildings that are actually good for us.
Absolutely. And I think the key takeaway here is that we're not powerless in this relationship. We have a choice in how we design these spaces, and the more aware we are of the impact they have on us, the better choices we can make.
That's a good point. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Ancient mysteries, secret societies, mind-controlling buildings.
Usual.
And yet somehow we've ended up in a place of, dare I say, optimism.
I'd say cautious optimism is probably the best way to put it.
Fair enough. So for our listeners who might be feeling a little uneasy right now, a little unsure about whether they should be side-eyeing that office building down the street.
Maybe just a quick glance, to be safe.
But seriously, folks, what's the biggest takeaway you hope people walk away with from this deep dive? What should we be thinking about, especially as our cities and our buildings become more and more complex?
I think the most important thing is just to be mindful. Pay attention to how different spaces make you feel. Ask yourself why you feel drawn to certain buildings and why others leave you feeling drained or on edge. Even if you don't buy into the whole sentient buildings thing, there's no denying that the spaces we inhabit have a profound impact on our lives. And understanding that impact, that's where we can start to make choices that support our well-being.
That's a great point. We spend so much of our lives in these built environments, it's easy to forget they even have an effect on us at all.
Exactly. And it's not about being afraid of buildings or even afraid of technology. It's about approaching these advancements with open eyes and asking ourselves not just, can we do this, but also, should we do this? And most importantly, how can we do this responsibly? Because we're not just building structures, we're shaping the environments where we live, work, and interact with each other. And those environments, they have the power to influence us in profound ways, for better or for worse.
Thinking about it, it's almost like we've been looking at this whole sentient buildings thing backward.
Hmm.
Instead of worrying about buildings taking over, maybe we should be asking ourselves how we can learn from them.
That's an interesting perspective. What do you mean by that?
Well, we've been talking about how buildings can influence our moods, our behavior, right? But what if we flipped the script and thought about how we could design buildings that actually make us feel better, that help us think more clearly, or even be more creative?
Yeah, I see where you're going with this. So instead of fearing the influence they might have over us, we should be looking at how we can use that influence for good.
Exactly. We know that spending time in nature can reduce stress, that it can boost our creativity. What if we could design buildings that have that same effect? Imagine working in an office that felt more like a walk in the woods.
Huh. That's the whole idea behind biophilic design, which we touched on earlier. And it's not just about, adding a few potted plants here and there. It's about really incorporating elements of nature in a way that impacts our well-being. Things like natural light, using organic shapes, even soundscapes that kind of mimic the natural world.
So less sterile office cubicle, more like working in a treehouse. I can get used to that.
Right. And it's not just about aesthetics either. There's a growing body of evidence that shows that this kind of design can actually improve focus, increase productivity, even reduce sick days.
Okay, so maybe we're not going to be seeing any sentient skyscrapers having existential crises anytime soon. But,
Not today.
but by exploring this theory, even if it sounds a little out there, we've maybe stumbled onto a whole new way of thinking about the spaces we inhabit. And potentially, a way to design buildings that are actually good for us.
Absolutely. And I think a key takeaway here is that we're not powerless in this relationship. We have a choice in how we design these spaces. And I think the more aware we are of the impact they have on us, the better choices we can make.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. I don't think I'll ever look at a skyscraper the same way again. But, okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Ancient beliefs, secret societies, mind-controlling buildings.
All in a day's work for us, really.
Right. But as fascinating as all that is, it does kind of leave you with this, unsettling feeling, like if our buildings are secretly judging us, or worse.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say judging.
You know what I mean? Like, is there anything we can actually do about any of this? Or are we just stuck at the mercy of whatever vibes our buildings are putting out?
That's a great question, and it's something that architects and designers are actually thinking about a lot these days.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more.
Well, you know how we were talking about how the design of a space can affect our mood and behavior?
Right, like how some places just feel off while others feel kind of good.
Exactly. Well, there's a whole field of study dedicated to understanding those effects, and it's called environmental psychology.
Environmental psychology.
Yeah.
So like the psychology of how our surroundings affect us.
Exactly. And one of the key insights from this field is that we're not just passive inhabitants of our spaces. We actually have a lot of agency in shaping how those spaces make us feel.
Okay, that's kind of empowering. So it's not just about being at the mercy of whatever the architect decided.
Right. There are things we can do even in our own homes and workplaces to create environments that support our well-being. And it starts with becoming aware of how different design elements affect us.
Okay, so what kind of design elements are we talking about? Give me some examples.
Well, one of the most important is lighting. Natural light in particular has been shown to have a huge impact on our mood, our energy levels, even our sleep cycle.
Oh, absolutely. I know I always feel better after spending some time outside in the sunshine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So something as simple as opening your blinds and letting in more natural light can actually make a big difference.
I like where this is going. What else?
Another big one is color. Different colors can evoke different emotions and even influence our behavior in subtle ways.
Oh, that's so true. I remember reading somewhere that certain colors, like blue and green, can actually promote a sense of calm, while others, like red and orange, can be more stimulating.
That's exactly right. So if you're feeling stressed or anxious, surrounding yourself with cooler colors might actually help you feel more relaxed.
Okay, color, lighting.
Yeah.
This is fascinating. What else can we do to make our spaces work for us?
Plants. Don't underestimate the power of a little greenery.
Plants. Seriously.
Seriously. Studies have shown that even just having a few plants in a room can reduce stress, improve air quality, and even boost creativity.
Huh. Maybe I should get a few more plants for my apartment. I always thought they were just for decoration, but if they can actually make me feel better.
It's worth a try. And the great thing about plants is that they connect us to nature, even in the most urban environments.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
There's just something about being in nature that makes you feel more grounded.
exactly. And that's something that biophilic design really taps into.
Wait, biophilic design, is that what you were talking about earlier?
It is. I know it's kind of a mouthful, but essentially it's a design philosophy that focuses on incorporating elements of the natural world into our built environments.
So more plants, more natural light, more of that good nature vibe.
Precisely. And it goes beyond just aesthetics. Biophilic design is really about recognizing our deep connection to the natural world and how important it is for our health and well-being to maintain that connection, even as we spend more and more time in urban environments.
So we're talking about designing buildings that work with our biology, with how we're naturally wired.
Exactly. It's about creating spaces that make us feel good, that support our health, and that ultimately help us thrive, which, when you think about it, is a pretty amazing thing to do with a building.
That is pretty amazing. So we can actually use design as a tool to make our lives better, to make
Yeah.
ourselves feel better.
Absolutely. And it's not just about our individual well-being either. There's a growing body of evidence suggesting that biophilic design can have a positive impact on everything from productivity and creativity to social cohesion and community building.
Okay, so we're talking about happier, healthier, more creative, more connected people, all thanks to the way we design our buildings.
That's the idea, yeah. And I think that's a pretty exciting prospect.
I'm with you there. So it sounds like even if our buildings aren't secretly sentient,
Yep.
even if they aren't, there's still so much potential for us to use design to create spaces that are not just functional, but actually life-enhancing. Spaces that make us feel good to be alive.
And that's a powerful thing. You know, thinking about it, it's almost like we've been looking at this whole sentient buildings thing backwards. Instead of worrying about buildings taking over, maybe we should be asking ourselves how we can learn from them.
That's an interesting perspective. What do you mean by that?
Well, we've been talking about how buildings can influence our mood and behavior,
Yeah.
right? But what if we flipped the script and thought about how we could design buildings that actually make us feel better, think more clearly, even be more creative?
Ah, I see where you're going with this. So instead of fearing the influence buildings might have over us, we should be exploring how to leverage that influence for good. Exactly. We know that spending time in nature can reduce stress and boost creativity. What if we could design buildings that have those same effects? Imagine working in an office that felt more like a walk in the woods.
That's the idea behind biophilic design, which we touched on earlier. It's not just about adding a few potted plants. It's about incorporating elements of nature in a way that really impacts our well-being. Things like natural light, organic shapes, even soundscapes that mimic the natural world.
So less sterile office cubicle, more like working in a treehouse. I could get used to that.
Right. And it's not just about aesthetics. There's a growing body of evidence showing that biophilic design can improve focus, productivity, and even reduce sick days.
Okay, so maybe we're not going to be seeing sentient skyscrapers having existential crises anytime soon. But by exploring this theory, we've stumbled onto a whole new way of thinking about the spaces we inhabit.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we have agency in this relationship. We can design buildings that serve us, inspire us, and even help us thrive.
Well said. So, to our listener, the next time you step into a building, take a moment to really experience it. Pay attention to how it makes you feel. Does it energize you, calm you, make you want to curl up with a good book, or conquer the world?
And ask yourself, what role do you want to play in shaping the buildings of the future?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with. This deep dive may be over, but the conversation is just beginning. Thanks for joining us.